Our story begins at the close of 1942, just as rumors began to spread across Germany. It was said that the Red Army had encircled General Paulus's 6th Army at Stalingrad. It was difficult for a people accustomed to the triumphs of their soldiers to believe that the largest formation of the Wehrmacht was doomed. Joseph Goebbels then announced a German Christmas colored by austerity and ideological fortitude. 2 years later, Berliners had little reason to celebrate Christmas 1944. Bombing raids had already turned much of the capital into ruins. People were exhausted by meager rations and constant strain. What once seemed like innocent dark jokes had now become, frankly, ghoulish humor. One of the common jokes went, "Be practical, give a coffin." Messages were written on the walls of destroyed buildings to let relatives know that the writer was elsewhere. Above these inscriptions, party warnings declared, "Looters will be punished by death." Air raids were so frequent that Berliners spent more time in cellars and shelters than in their beds. The shelters, lit by blue lamps, were cramped. People were tightly packed, dressed in their warmest clothing, carrying small cardboard suitcases that held sandwiches and thermoses. The ceilings were painted with luminous paint in case the lighting failed. Berlin lacked enough cover for its population of 3 million, so the shelters were always overflowing. The initials LR, meaning Luftschutzraum, air raid shelter, were popularly deciphered as Learn Schnell, Russisch Learn Russian Fast. Most Berliners stopped saying Heil Hitler and greeted each other with the phrase Bleib übrig, stay alive. Berliners greatly feared the invaders from the east. Goebbels' propaganda relentlessly repeated the atrocity at Nemmersdorf, where Red Army troops were said to have raped and murdered hundreds of residents. Their fear was enormous, as the offensive seemed inevitable. The Ardennes offensive in December 1944 raised German civilian morale somewhat. They believed in the Führer and the wonder weapon, thinking they could hold the world hostage. However, the High Command did not share this optimism. General Staff officers rightly feared that the offensive in the West would weaken the Eastern Front at a crucial moment. Nevertheless, Hitler was obsessed with turning the tide of events and forcing the Allies to reach an agreement. He rejected any attempts at rapprochement with the Soviet Union. Guderian warned Hitler of the Red Army's concentration of forces for a massive offensive, but Hitler disregarded these assessments. He was convinced of the weakness of the Soviet divisions. Hitler stubbornly clung to the western direction despite the imminent threat from the east. On January 13, 1945, General Ivan Danilovich Chernyakhovsky launched a massive offensive in East Prussia. Before the operation began, Soviet troops were told they were entering the fascist beast's lair. Although the Germans put up noticeable resistance, by January 24th, Soviet forces stood at the gates of Königsberg, the capital of East Prussia. To the south, Marshal Konstantin Rokossovsky's troops attacked on January 14th with the goal of cutting off East Prussia. In the very first night, German General Georg Hans Reinhardt warned Hitler of the threat, but he was ignored. Soviet troops caught the Germans by surprise, which led to a swift advance. Gauleiter Erich Koch, the regional party leader responsible for East Prussia, refused to evacuate civilians and poorly coordinated actions with the army. Moreover, he mistakenly directed refugee trains to already captured areas, worsening the chaos. But when Soviet troops approached his headquarters, Koch fled, leaving the civilians to face the Red Army. Many tried to save themselves from the advancing troops, but the snow and low temperatures led to tragic consequences. In one village, the NKVD discovered 100 corpses of civilians in the snow, victims of a deadly march. These were the bodies of women with Stars of David on their clothing, killed by point-blank shots. The advancing Red Army exhibited widespread cruelty toward the civilian population, including sexual assault and pillage. Soviet soldiers saw the Germans as objects of revenge for the atrocities of the Nazis in the Soviet Union. The Soviet command attempted to control the troops, but this had little effect. The soldiers were stunned by the wealth and order they found in German homes. This gave rise to envy, anger, and destruction. Political workers and NKVD censors tried to control the information, but the soldiers' actions were difficult to restrain. Soldiers looted houses, taking valuables and often destroying what they could not carry. The NKVD reported widespread destruction and the mass flight of the German civilian population. From January to mid-February 1945, almost 8.5 million Germans left their homes. The Red Army's offensive in East Prussia meant the complete destruction of a region deeply connected to German culture and history. The horrors of war were evident in every village and every town through which the Soviet troops passed. For the Soviet soldiers, everything was quite simple. The war had simply moved from the Soviet Union to German homes. What had happened in Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine was now unfolding on German territory. Moving west, the Red Army found lands devastated by German troops. They saw the horrors of the German occupation and were determined to make the Germans pay. By the end of January, chaos reigned in Berlin. Air raid warnings came every night. Refugees who continued to arrive in the city told gruesome stories about the Red Army. Hungary, an ally of Germany, was now on the side of the Soviet Union. There were rumors about the collapse of the Eastern Front. Railway workers knew about the enemy's advance better than the general staff. Many Germans secretly listened to the BBC to get reliable news. Despite the risks, they searched for the truth about what was happening. Some Germans hoped that the Soviet troops would only harm officers and SS members. Public transport was still running, and people tried desperately to get to work. It became common to sleep closer to the workplace. Berliners prepared for the arrival of relatives and friends whose homes had been destroyed by the bombing. Those with connections tried to flee the capital. Goebbels declared that leaving Berlin without permission was desertion. The number of executions carried out by the SS on Himmler's orders increased. On January 23rd, members of the resistance connected with the July 20th plot were executed. Goebbels' slogan, "We will win, because we must win," no longer convinced many. Hitler was rarely seen. He seemed weak and old. Officers visiting the Reich Chancellery witnessed sharp changes in his appearance and behavior. The once powerful leader now looked like an old man. Hitler trusted no one in his entourage. Meanwhile, Marshal Konev's First Ukrainian Front advanced rapidly, taking Krakow and Radom. The German 17th Army fled to the Oder. Marshal Zhukov's First Belarusian Front was rapidly moving toward Berlin. Stalin ordered Zhukov to wait for Rokossovsky's troops. Zhukov objected to the delay of the offensive. His troops advanced through the Wartheland, meeting weak German resistance. The Poles' thirst for revenge was strong. Soviet troops treated the German population harshly. On February 23rd, Poznan fell to Soviet tanks, and the battle was drawing closer to Berlin. Soviet troops reached the Oder, creating bridgeheads near Kustrin. German troops were stunned by the speed of the Soviet offensive and could not prepare an adequate defense. It seemed only a matter of weeks before the Soviet boot entered the Nazi capital. The fall of Berlin, a capital in ruins. April 20th, 1945, Adolf Hitler's 56th birthday, was marked by a salute staged by the artillerymen of the First Belarusian Front. On that day, they began shelling Berlin and did not stop until the city fell. 3 days later, a Soviet newspaper announced that their soldiers were on the streets of Berlin. That same morning, the Nazis announced Hitler's decision to remain in Berlin, giving the battle a pan-European significance. For the civilian residents of Berlin, these ideological issues were of little concern. The only thing that mattered was survival. Under the shelling, one of the largest shelters in Berlin was the bunker at the Anhalter Bahnhof station. This reinforced concrete structure had 3 above-ground and 2 underground floors. The thickness of its walls was 4.5 meters. Conditions in the bunker became terrible. Up to 12,000 people huddled in an area of 3,600 square meters. The crowd was so dense that getting to the toilet was impossible. One woman spent 6 days on a single staircase step. In such conditions, hygiene became a serious problem. But with the water supply cut off, drinking water became an even greater priority. There was a pump near the station, and young women at the entrance risked their lives to get some water. Those who returned alive were highly valued by those too weak or frightened to search for water themselves. The morale among German soldiers was no better. Even the most resolute now seemed weak and frightened. German officers and soldiers began appearing in shelters in civilian clothes. Desertion seemed natural to many. The enemy's approach particularly affected young soldiers desperately wanting to lose their virginity. Girls, fearing sexual assault by Soviet soldiers, preferred to give themselves to German boys first. Chaos led to an increase in sexual activity in dark cellars and bunkers. A Norwegian journalist observed how young men and women in uniform indulged their instincts in a frantic pursuit of pleasure. though this ignored the girls' fear of violence. Another manifestation of the chaos gripping the city was the scene of mass hoarding of supplies. Gerda Peterson, a young secretary, joined a group of women looting a Luftwaffe ration car. When Soviet planes attacked, strafing with machine gun fire, Gerda hid under a cart. She saw a woman carrying a roll of toilet paper killed and thought how awful it was to die like that. When the electricity was cut off, rumors became the main source of news. False stories spread quickly. Nazi propaganda, which called for resistance to the last drop of blood, was replaced by Soviet leaflets informing German soldiers that further resistance was meaningless. These leaflets were effective, and many German soldiers showed them to Soviet soldiers when surrendering. Soviet propagandists also distributed leaflets addressed to the women of Berlin, assuring them they would not be harmed and urging them to persuade German soldiers to surrender. However, Berliners had every reason to expect a completely different future. They were desperate and in chaos, especially the women and youth who faced the threat of sexual assault. Hope for a miracle that would save them from such a fate faded. In this state, the city of Berlin met the Soviet troops advancing from the east and southeast. The defense of Berlin was commanded by General Helmuth Weidling with approximately 45,000 troops, including the Wehrmacht, SS, and the poorly trained Volkssturm. They were opposed by 500,000 Soviet troops. As the Soviet troops approached, the defenders fiercely resisted, but they were significantly outnumbered. While the battle for Berlin raged, Hitler remained in his bunker, raving about a turning point in the war. One of his last orders was to destroy the city's infrastructure and everything that could be useful to the Soviet troops. Bridges were blown up, food supplies destroyed, and subway stations flooded, killing thousands of civilians who had sought refuge there. The city was in chaos as Soviet troops advanced further into Berlin. With each passing day, they met less resistance from the exhausted and outnumbered defenders. The once proud city crumbled. Buildings were destroyed. Streets were covered with rubble and corpses. The last attempts by the soldiers to defend were brave, but ultimately useless. Early on May 2nd, Soviet troops captured the Reich Chancellery. On the same day, the famous red flag of the Soviet Union was raised over the Reichstag. Berlin, the heart of Nazi Germany, fell to the Soviet troops, marking the end of the Third Reich. For the Soviet soldiers, the fall of Berlin was a moment of enormous joy. The war was over, and victory was in their hands. However, the victory celebrations quickly turned into chaos. Excited by success, Soviet soldiers became quite aggressive. Discipline in the troops broke down, and the men began to pillage and commit acts of violence. Excessive alcohol consumption among the soldiers became common. They drank an abnormally large amount of spirits. Political workers tried to control the drunken army, but it was impossible. Celebrations that included singing, dancing, and heavy drinking led to even more disorder. Soldiers broke into apartments in search of food, spirits, and valuables. In many cases, Soviet soldiers attacked homes and killed their occupants, even when they tried to surrender. Some German soldiers and Volkssturm members displayed white flags but were still killed. The situation worsened every day, and the violence seemed endless. It should be noted that there were also soldiers who behaved decently. A sapper unit entered an apartment and finding a sick woman gave her food and left. However, overall, the attitude toward Berliners was brutal, exceeding the ordinary norms of decency. Although the war was over, the citizens of Berlin and all of Germany had much more to endure, especially the women facing a cruel reckoning. The horrors of the occupation of Berlin. For Red Army soldiers invading Germany from the east, road signs were placed everywhere along the border, urging them to show no mercy to the Germans. "Soldier, you are in Germany. Avenge the Hitlerites." With such an order, it is not surprising that Soviet troops showed no remorse toward the German population, including the most defenseless women. Red Army soldiers saw them as part of their revenge, and it was a terrible revenge. After the fall of Berlin, the first 2 or 3 days of the occupation were relatively peaceful for its residents because the Soviet soldiers were too busy pursuing the retreating German troops to cause much harm to the civilians. In fact, civilians showed little caution, looting food warehouses and searching for fuel. But from the 4th day, this ended. A continuous string of looting and sexual assault began. Soviet soldiers assaulted women of all ages, from young girls to old women. They did not care whether these women were Nazis or not. The fact that most of the soldiers were drunk aggravated the brutality. The soldiers did not look for secluded places for their crimes. They assaulted women openly in the ruins of houses and on the streets. They assaulted women even in front of their families. The horrific experience endured by the women of Berlin was actually just another difficulty in a string of misfortunes that had befallen them after losing their homes and loved ones in battle, becoming refugees, being wounded or imprisoned, and watching their children suffer from disease and malnutrition. Sexual assault became part of their survival story in war-torn Germany. One observer noted that sexual assault had become routine. Margaret Bovary, a German journalist, recorded her experiences in a survival diary she kept during the Battle of Berlin. On May 8, 1945, she wrote, "I rode my bicycle with a disheveled girl who had been captive of the Russians for 14 days. She was sexually assaulted but was well fed. Ordinary cases of sexual assault occurred. A neighbor who resisted was shot. Mrs. Krauss was not sexually assaulted. She insists that Russians do not touch women wearing glasses. I would like to know if this is true. The troops were quite drunk, but they distinguished between young and old, which is already progress. Even Jews and anti-fascists who came out of hiding to meet the liberators often felt betrayed. Inga Deutschkron, who was hiding with her mother, recalled her joy when she heard the approach of Russian tanks toward Berlin. Coming out of the basement to greet them, a soldier approached her with a smile and grabbed her clothing. Come, Frau. Come. Come, dame. Come." She ran to her mother, who sighed. So it's true. And she hoped that their Jewish identity papers would protect them. However, the soldiers could not even read the document. Nevertheless, Soviet soldiers did not look for victims only on the streets. They also burst into bunkers and basements where Germans were hiding from the fierce fighting, and there they assaulted women in front of children and men. In some cases, soldiers chose women according to their preferences. In others, women were sexually assaulted by a group. Soldiers assaulted everyone indiscriminately, attacking both 70-year-old women and young girls. The first anti-fascist mayor of Charlottenburg noted, "In the beginning, the Russians looted on a massive scale. They looted individuals, warehouses, stores, and homes. Countless cases of sexual assault occurred daily. A woman could not avoid sexual assault unless she hid. It is difficult to comprehend the full extent to which sexual assault was practiced. Sexual assault in the bunkers was accompanied by ruthless looting and new cases of sexual assault in apartments and houses throughout Berlin. Germans filed numerous statements complaining to local authorities. A police report sent to the Spandau City Hall and forwarded to the Soviet commandant of Spandau describes an incident that occurred at night. 3 Russian soldiers broke a corridor window, forced a resident to open the door, and then searched the second-floor apartments with him. When one of the women tried to scream, the soldiers threatened them with a pistol. Another woman called for her mother, but a soldier forced her into another room and held her at gunpoint while searching the suitcases. Meanwhile, the other 2 soldiers sexually assaulted the remaining woman. Extreme violence was widespread. A petition from Berlin-Reinickendorf dated June 28, 1945, describes an attack that occurred on May 4th. 2 drunk Russian soldiers attacked a married couple. The 62-year-old wife was sexually assaulted by both soldiers, and her 66-year-old husband was shot. Later, a 3rd Russian came and sexually assaulted the wife again. Faces of war, suffering, and resistance in Berlin, 1945. In the last weeks of the war in Berlin, as the Third Reich collapsed, the civilian population faced terrifying ordeals. The occupation of the city by the Red Army brought not only an end to the Nazi tyranny, but also a new wave of sexual assault that primarily targeted women. Sources from those days paint grim pictures of a ruined city where fear and despair became daily realities. Among the many testimonies, stories of monstrous acts of violence stand out. Tragedies occurred in residential areas such as Dahlem, leaving deep scars. Fathers trying to protect their daughters died at the hands of soldiers. Women were attacked, sometimes en masse, on the streets and even on roofs, from which many, in a bid to escape, threw themselves down. Indoors, women were forcibly given alcohol or other liquids before the attack. At the same time, as observers noted, The behavior of the Soviet soldiers was not uniform. Alongside acts of extreme brutality were examples of humanity. Some reporters described the soldiers' actions as a combination of brutality and mercy. In some homes, a nightmare occurred, leading to the death of victims. In others, soldiers showed surprising kindness, sharing supplies and offering protection. This inconsistency was compared to a summer storm that destroys only part of the harvest. Testimonies of that time abound with such contrasts. Suicides were prevented and victims protected by a compassionate officer, or an attack on a girl was stopped by the assailant's own comrades. Some German eyewitnesses recalled how the same soldiers who could display extreme cruelty would immediately share their last piece of bread with German children or help an elderly woman on the road. Their behavior was compared to that of primitive children, capable of incredible tenderness and at the same time, merciless cruelty. This was an unpredictable force, capable of simultaneously shooting a man, assaulting a woman, giving a child chocolate, and admiring rabbits. Perhaps the duality of those feelings is most accurately conveyed by the testimony of Junior Sergeant Ratkina, a telephone operator. She recalled a sexually assaulted German woman with a grenade between her legs and admitted that then, in the early days, she felt no shame, which came later. She told of 5 German girls who came to the battalion asking for help after a night of assault, and how the soldiers were asked to identify the perpetrators for execution themselves, but the girls refused further bloodshed. Her words, "Of course this is war. Of course you'd think it was easy to forgive, to see whole white houses with tiled roofs with roses. I myself wanted to torment them. Of course I wanted to see their tears. It was impossible to suddenly become kind, fair, and merciful. As kind as you now sympathize with them, it will take decades." This was another tragic aspect of that dark historical period, the art of survival. How women resisted in war-torn Berlin. Having survived devastating bombings and street fighting, German women faced a new, more personal threat of becoming victims of sexual assault by confused soldiers. In this struggle for survival, they resorted to a variety of measures. Many tried to make themselves less attractive. They rubbed their faces with dirt and soot, cut their hair short, and dressed in men's clothes to blend in with the crowd. Others wore several layers of clothing to look fuller and less feminine. Pretending to be sick with typhus or a venereal disease was also an effective deterrent, as even drunk soldiers feared contagion. The most common tactic was hiding. Women spent most of their time in basements or other secret places, especially during the hours when soldiers were most actively moving through the city. Some sought refuge in homes with elderly people or children, hoping that such places would be less likely to be attacked. When going out for food or water, women tried to move in groups, believing that numerical superiority would ensure safety. Bribery and negotiation were widely used. Women used any valuables, watches, jewelry, food, to buy their way out of violence. In some cases, they tried to negotiate directly with the soldiers, appealing to their conscience or compassion. Communal efforts played an important role. Women united for mutual protection, creating makeshift barricades in houses and basements. They organized watch shifts to warn in time of approaching danger. There were also cases where women tried to find patronage among high-ranking officers. This often involved entering into voluntary sexual relationships with officers in exchange for protection against attacks by the rank and file. This tactic gave rise to one of the strangest paradoxes. Victims turned into those who used the situation to their advantage. In diaries of that time, one can find testimony about the emergence of genuine attachments between German women and Soviet officers. An anonymous narrator in A Woman in Berlin describes her decision after a series of attacks. "I exclaimed loudly, 'Curse it,' and made a decision. I needed an influential man, an officer who would protect me." She began practicing phrases to address officers, feeling that now she was not just a voiceless prey, but was acting and planning. Women also used any existing connections or knowledge of Russian to establish contact that could prevent sexual assault. Quiet suffering, the heavy legacy of wartime sexual assault. Despite all attempts to avoid attacks, many women became victims of sexual assault, and the fear of sexual violence remained an integral part of their lives during the occupation. In Berlin alone, according to various estimates, Tens of thousands of women were assaulted, and some sources cite figures of up to 100,000 and even 1,000,000 throughout Germany, as many were assaulted repeatedly. It is estimated that up to 10,000 women died as a result of these attacks. The brutality of the Soviet soldiers was not limited to Berlin. Women of all ages throughout Germany suffered from mass sexual assaults. Their number reached almost 2 million. Surviving such a horror was only the beginning of the suffering. A multitude of women became pregnant as a result of the violence. The scale of unwanted pregnancies was such that the Ministry of Internal Affairs was forced to acknowledge the problem and recommend the creation of special departments for such women in large cities. In one such department in the Berlin district of Neukölln, the number of requests for abortions due to sexual assault by Soviet soldiers sharply increased. From June 1945 to June 1946, almost 10,000 such abortions were approved. Doctors and nurses worked in the toughest conditions. Among the medics performing abortions were both anti-fascists appointed by the new authorities and former members of the Nazi Party temporarily suspended from private practice. Abortions were necessary, but women had to provide a detailed explanation of their circumstances. Statements submitted to the health authorities often reflected the social position and even hints of the racial hygiene of the time. Women wrote about their difficult life circumstances, the presence of other children, the loss of loved ones, and the impossibility of raising a child conceived as a result of violence. One woman described how she was assaulted by a Mongol on her way to work and stated that she would not be able to carry this pregnancy to term, as it would lead to her own death, leaving her children orphans. Others, having several children and husbands who had not returned from the war, also requested an abortion, fearing that the children would also lose their mother. The legacy of this campaign of violence was also the spread of venereal diseases. Doctors returning to work focused on examining women and girls and preparing the necessary abortions. The situation with sexual assault, diseases, and unwanted pregnancies continued until 1946 and beyond. The increase in the number of abortions after the campaign of violence clearly demonstrates the scale of what was happening and its destructive impact on women's lives. Medical workers and social services were forced to urgently adapt to meet the needs of these women. Documents preserved in the archives testify to widespread suffering and efforts to provide at least some assistance. The legacy of the sexual assault committed by Soviet soldiers left a deep and indelible mark on the fate of many women, and the increase in the number of abortions underscores the desperate circumstances in which they found themselves. The unleashed fury understanding the motives for the sexual assault. The testimonies of German women who survived the sexual assault are truly horrifying and demand the strongest condemnation of those who committed these atrocities. However, the question arises, why did the Red Army soldiers act this way? What could push a person to such actions against a weaker being? Although eyewitnesses of the mass sexual assaults would undoubtedly call these soldiers monsters and savages, the answer to this question is much more complex. To understand this, one must go back a year to the summer of 1944. The scene unfolds at the Yanovska concentration camp in Ukraine, liberated by Soviet troops. The retreating Germans had left behind fresh corpses in shallow sand graves. It was easy for the soldiers to find them. The bodies were barely covered with sand in narrow trenches. An unbearable smell of corpses hung over the place, attracting flies. This scene deeply shocked the soldiers, many of whom encountered such horror for the first time. The deceased had their hands tied behind their backs with bullet holes in their skulls. The women's hair had been torn out by German guards when they were dragged to the trenches. The prisoners of Janovska left their testimonies about what they experienced. These testimonies in Russian archives tell of the horrors of the German war of extermination against the Soviet Union. One description recounts the atrocities of the camp commandant, Oberführer Velgas, who, along with his wife, shot at prisoners working on the camp territory. Very often he ordered the guards to throw children into the air and shoot them, to the delight of his 9-year-old daughter who shouted, "Daddy, again! Again!" The horrific scenes in Yanovska were carefully documented by the Soviet propaganda machine. It made sure that every Soviet soldier saw photographs of the emaciated prisoners and the heaps of corpses. Newspapers, radio, and political workers emphasized the need for revenge against the Germans for their actions. Slogans like, "Kill the German" and "Avenge the Hitlerites" were ubiquitous. This constant stream of anti-German messages formed hatred, and a thirst for retribution among the soldiers. With every step westward, the Red Army found more and more camps, mass graves, and tens of thousands of bodies. The fury reached its peak when the soldiers saw their exhausted countrywomen, 16-year-old girls kidnapped by the Germans from their homeland, who sobbed in their arms, telling about their stolen youth. If the surviving prisoners, exhausted and sick, could not demand revenge from their liberators, the sight of the decaying bodies in the graves did so silently. Then the Red Army entered Prussia, onto German territory, and saw picturesque villages with white houses and well-kept gardens. People here lived as if there had been no war. They had not experienced an iota of the trauma that the rest of the continent had endured. This was a stark contrast to the image of Soviet territory, where German soldiers had left behind only scorched earth. Incited by their own propaganda for revenge, Soviet soldiers were determined to make the Germans pay. Thus, the policy of collective punishment played a key role in the crimes committed by Soviet soldiers. The Soviet leadership believed that the entire German population was responsible for the war and deserved punishment. Soldiers were instilled with the idea that every German was an enemy, and they should be treated accordingly. In addition to the desire for revenge and the policy of collective punishment, other factors contributed to the surge in war crimes. One of them was the breakdown of discipline in the Red Army. The rapid advance of troops into Germany created a chaotic environment where it was difficult to maintain ordinary military discipline. Commanders often turned a blind eye to the atrocities because military objectives had a higher priority. Many soldiers acted on impulse, without fear of punishment. Would you like to know more about the impact of the Red Army's occupation on the German civilian population? The Soviet advance into German territory brought with it a complex wave of violence against the civilian population. Historians agree that the Red Army committed widespread atrocities, including mass looting, assault, and murder in retribution for the vicious war the Nazis had waged against the Soviet Union. This was a war of vengeance for the German Vernichtungskrieg, or war of annihilation, on the Eastern Front. Under those conditions, alcohol played a significant role in the behavior of the soldiers. Drunkenness was widespread among the troops. That led to an increase in aggression and violence. Alcohol lowered inhibitions and made the soldiers more prone to brutal actions. Drunken soldiers often went out of control, engaging in looting, assault, and killings, showing no respect for life, much less for consequences. One cannot underestimate the psychological impact of the war on Soviet soldiers. The trauma of years of savage fighting, the loss of comrades, and the constant threat of death deeply affected their mental well-being. Many became desensitized to violence and death. This psychological trauma made it easier to commit atrocities against the German population. The war transformed many soldiers into hardened and brutal individuals, capable of extreme violence. It is important to remember that the Second World War, especially on the Eastern Front, was a war of total annihilation. It was characterized by a complete breakdown of social norms and an absence of the laws of warfare in the occupied domains. The logic of this war was that it should be fought without limits. In such an environment, the worst side of human nature in the soldiers came to the surface, and they were allowed to act according to their most primitive instincts. One can conclude that the behavior of Soviet soldiers in Germany was influenced by a combination of factors. These included propaganda, personal experience, lack of discipline, and the chaotic environment of the war. These factors together created a situation in which mass atrocities were committed against the German population. The desire for vengeance, material gain, and the breakdown of social norms all played a part in the brutal behavior of the Soviet troops. The question of justice was often denied. The complexities of addressing wartime crimes are clear when considering Stalin's position regarding the accusations of mass assault committed by Red Army soldiers in Germany. Stalin's stance was one of denial and deflection of blame. During and after the war, Stalin and the Soviet leadership were reluctant to acknowledge or address the widespread sexual violence committed by Soviet forces. They promoted an image of the Red Army as a liberator, bringing freedom and justice to the peoples of Europe, including Germany. Acknowledging mass assault would have contradicted this propaganda narrative. When reports of mass violence surfaced, they were often minimized or dismissed as hostile claims aimed at undermining the reputation of the Red Army. Soviet statements presented their forces as exemplary in discipline and morally superior to the defeated fascist formations. Another tactic was to explain or justify the actions of Soviet servicemen. A concept was constructed which held that after the horrors and brutality of the war, including the atrocities committed by the Nazis on Soviet territory, the soldiers' actions were a form of retribution or understandable behavior in a chaotic post-war period. However, on the ground, Soviet authorities made efforts to address and suppress the crimes of sexual violence committed by their soldiers. If a soldier was suspected of such an act, an investigation was conducted. One method used was the identification of the accused soldiers. Victims, typically women, were asked to point out their abusers. Though this process was fraught with difficulty for the victims, as they had to relive a traumatic experience, some found the courage to identify their aggressors. Soviet documents contain the story of a group of soldiers accused of assaulting a German girl. The girl was brutally assaulted, and the soldiers were identified as the culprits. The accused were brought before their commanders, who sought to ensure justice. They asked the girl to identify her abusers. Despite her fear and trauma, the girl was able to point out the soldiers who had harmed her. The identified soldiers then faced a court of their commanders. The punishment for such crimes was severe, and in many cases, it included execution by firing squad. Such harsh punishment was intended primarily as a deterrent to others. The goal was to show that such actions would not be tolerated, even in wartime. Another method of combating sexual violence was direct confrontation with the soldiers themselves. Some servicemen took it upon themselves to punish the guilty. They believed the honor of their unit was at stake. They did not want the actions of a few to tarnish the reputation of the majority. The acts of violence also had a wider effect on the morale of the soldiers. Many felt shame for the actions of their comrades. These soldiers confronted the aggressors and administered punishment on the spot. This often involved physical force, as they sought to teach the offenders a lesson. Additionally, it was not uncommon for victims themselves to seek justice, bravely pursuing retribution against their abusers. Many women showed extraordinary courage in the face of adversity. Despite all these efforts, addressing and combating the problem of sexual violence during the war was not always successful. The chaos and confusion of the battlefield made it difficult to consistently apply justice. Many victims did not report what had happened due to fear or shame. They feared condemnation or not being believed. This fear often kept them from seeking justice. The patriarchal nature of the military environment also played a part. Some commanders were reluctant to believe victims or take their accusations seriously. This reluctance hampered efforts to effectively suppress acts of violence. There were also cases where soldiers attempting to confront abusers faced retaliation. They were accused of undermining unit unity. This charge made it difficult for them to pursue justice. Despite these obstacles, some soldiers persisted in their efforts. They were driven by a sense of duty and honor, a determination to uphold the values they believed in. These attempts to address and combat the acts of violence during the war underscore the complexity of justice during conflict. They show the struggle between the desire to maintain order and confronting the harsh realities of war. Fortunately for German women, the situation changed dramatically after the war ended, and some order was established in the Soviet occupation zone. Facing a rising number of reports of violence that threatened to seriously undermine the Red Army's self-proclaimed reputation as a liberator, Soviet authorities began to treat crimes of sexual assault with greater seriousness. The Presidium of the Supreme Soviet increased the penalty for assault. They made it a crime punishable by imprisonment for a term of 10 to 15 years in a corrective labor camp. This directive was aimed at addressing widespread violence and improving Soviet-German relations. Senior officers were instructed to ensure discipline among their troops. They emphasized the need for respectful treatment of the German population. The Soviet military leadership sought to instill a sense of responsibility and discipline in their soldiers. Unit commanders took decisive action against soldiers caught committing violence. In some cases, the perpetrators were executed in front of the ranks to deter others. For example, a commander in Magdeburg was known to have executed soldiers caught red-handed committing assault. These harsh penalties were meant to send a clear message that such behavior would not be tolerated. At the same time, propaganda efforts were undertaken to encourage soldiers to behave with dignity and uphold the reputation of the Red Army. Officers were reminded of their duty to uphold the principles of Soviet socialism and protect the civilian population in the occupied domains. Soviet authorities also implemented measures to isolate their troops from the German population to prevent incidents of violence. Orders were issued to move Soviet soldiers out of German homes and quarter them in barracks or military camps. In some areas, entire villages were evacuated to create separate zones for Soviet troops and the local population. This separation was intended to reduce the opportunities for soldiers to commit crimes against civilians. Efforts were made to control the movement of Soviet troops and limit their interaction with German civilians. Soldiers were required to have written permission from their commanders to visit German homes. Unauthorized visits were punished with strict penalties. This measure was designed to curb uncontrolled interactions between Soviet soldiers and German women, reducing the risk of violence. Despite these efforts, the enforcement of discipline was inconsistent. Some commanders were more effective than others in maintaining control over their troops. In some cases, commanders turned a blind eye to the actions of their soldiers or were unable to enforce strict measures due to the chaotic nature of the post-war environment. The Soviet military administration also undertook efforts to address the issue of alcohol consumption among the troops. Drunkenness was a significant factor contributing to the soldiers' violent behavior. Efforts were made to curb alcohol use and related problems. However, the availability of alcohol and the lack of strict control continued to exacerbate the situation. The dark side of liberation. The dark side of liberation is the sexual violence as a means of waging war. When discussing the mass sexual violence committed by Soviet troops, it is also important to consider that German women were not their only victims. The crime of sexual assault was not the exclusive preserve of the Red Army soldiers. Women in Hungary, Romania, and other nations allied with Nazi Germany also suffered the same brutal fate once the Red Army stepped onto their territory. Depending on the region, the scale of the violence was comparable to Germany. A curious fact is that Soviet soldiers were not immune from committing violence even in Allied countries. In late 1944, early 1945, the Red Army was advancing through northern Yugoslavia during the final stages of the Second World War. Despite Yugoslavia being a friendly nation, this fact did not prevent Soviet soldiers from committing violence and other cruel acts against the local population. Though the number of women assaulted by the Red Army in Yugoslavia was significantly lower compared to the hundreds of thousands of women in Germany and other enemy countries, the Red Army's behavior in Yugoslavia was still brutal. As we have learned, Soviet propaganda played a significant role in shaping soldiers' behavior. In the case of Yugoslavia, the propaganda emphasized the common struggle against the Germans and the heroism of the Yugoslav partisans. Soldiers were told to respect Yugoslav traditions, laws, and families. However, despite these messages, many Soviet soldiers still committed violence and other crimes. Tito, the communist leader of Yugoslavia, frequently complained to Soviet commanders about the Red Army's improper behavior. These complaints led to stricter disciplinary measures against offenders. For instance, soldiers who committed assault could be sentenced to long terms in labor camps, or even execution. However, not all soldiers who committed crimes were caught or punished. In some instances, Soviet officers took decisive action against their subordinates who committed a crime. For example, an officer who assaulted a woman could be executed, and this punishment would be communicated to other soldiers as a warning. Despite these efforts, the Red Army's presence in Yugoslavia still led to significant suffering for many women and their families. This behavior of the Red Army in Yugoslavia and other countries only adds another layer of complexity to their wartime conduct. The assertion that the topic of wartime crimes involving sexual violence is much more complex than it might seem at first glance is supported by the fact that Soviet soldiers were not the only Allied troops prone to violence. American, British, and French soldiers also left their brutal mark on their way through Germany. As for American soldiers, the violence began immediately after the Normandy landings. French women became a particular target because American men viewed them as easy prey. American soldiers believed the myth created by propaganda about the sexual availability of French women. The American Army Command did little to maintain discipline among its troops. They justified the soldiers' behavior by blaming French social problems. When the number of assault reports increased, the Army leadership mostly blamed African American soldiers, who were harshly persecuted and punished. However, this was not the end of the brutal behavior of American soldiers. Moreover, it continued on an even larger scale in Germany. The violence often occurred during the troops' rapid advance. In April 1945 alone, 37 soldiers were convicted of assault. The violence was often brutal. German women were beaten unconscious and subjected to oral or anal penetration. According to military statistics, about half of the assailants in the first months after the war were charged and brought to justice for assaulting teenagers. The youngest reported victim was 7 years old, and the oldest 69. According to one study on the topic, American soldiers committed assault against approximately 14,000 women across Western Europe, most of them in Germany. However, U.S. National Archives documents show that all crimes, including assault, committed by American soldiers were more frequent than officially reported. British soldiers also committed assault, though less frequently than the Americans. Many British soldiers felt a sense of power over the defeated German population and used violence as a way to demonstrate that power. British soldiers often justified their actions, claiming that German women were willing participants, despite many victims showing signs of resistance. French soldiers, including servicemen from colonial units, were also implicated in many cases of assault. Reports indicate that in some areas under French control, the frequency of sexual violence was alarmingly high. In Stuttgart, for example, hundreds of cases of assault were reported shortly after the city's occupation by French forces in April 1945. French soldiers were billeted in civilian homes, which led to close contact with the German population. This proximity resulted in numerous instances of sexual assault. French soldiers often viewed German women as trophies of war and felt entitled to their bodies. French military authorities did little to maintain discipline among their troops or protect German women, similar to their American allies. The French also attributed the crime of assault to colonial troops from North and West Africa. This aspect was sometimes exploited by Nazi propaganda, and later by certain elements within Germany, to stir up racial sentiments and divert attention from the broader issue of discipline and military responsibility. These acts of violence committed by American, British, and French soldiers show that crimes of sexual assault committed by soldiers were part of a broader pattern of sexual conquest during and after the Second World War. Soldiers often viewed women as the spoils of war and felt entitled to their bodies. Military authorities often ignored or downplayed the cases of violence, blaming the victims or using racial prejudice to justify their actions. German women, already suffering from the destruction of the war, were forced to accept violence as a common part of warfare, which added another trauma. Scars on the soul. Scars on the soul represents the indelible trauma of war for women. Like the Soviet soldiers, the Americans, British, and French were driven by anger and a desire for vengeance against the Germans. German propaganda had instilled stereotypes in the population, depicting the Soviet people as savages from the East. When the Soviet army entered Germany, many Germans were gripped by terror. Nazi propaganda had warned them that Soviet soldiers would bring destruction, death, and unimaginable horrors. As Soviet forces established control, many Germans hung white flags from their homes, signaling their surrender. Soviet soldiers did not meet strong resistance. Most men capable of fighting were gone. They were either too young or too old, leaving only women, children, and the elderly. The fear of violence and brutal acts spread like wildfire. This fear was so strong that many German women avoided hospitals after being assaulted. Soviet troops tried to combat the spread of venereal diseases, creating medical centers. But few women sought help there. Rumors spread that these centers were traps for identifying healthy women and sending them to forced labor in Siberia. Some women even believed that the treatment they might receive in these centers could be worse than the diseases themselves. Despite the fear and the ongoing wave of violence, organized resistance was almost non-existent. The war had exhausted the Germans, and with the disappearance of the Nazi regime, they had nothing left to fight for. Soviet forces, especially the NKVD, were also very effective in suppressing any resistance. They conducted mass arrests, often detaining people simply on suspicion of hostility to Soviet rule. Many Germans believed that a new war between the Soviet Union and the Western powers was inevitable. They thought this would free them from Soviet control. This belief, known as the war myth, gave them some hope, but it also made people more passive, waiting for help that never came. The fear of violence and brutal acts caused women to change their behavior and daily habits. Women avoided going out alone, especially at night, and took measures to protect themselves and their families. Some even resorted to extreme measures, such as fleeing their homes or suicide, to escape the threat of violence. The pervasive fear created an atmosphere of insecurity and terror that affected daily life in German communities. The most terrible aspect was that the crimes of violence had a profound and lasting social and psychological impact on German women in society. Many women experienced deep trauma from the violence inflicted upon them. The psychological scars left by these crimes were severe, causing lasting emotional harm. Victims felt shame, guilt, and fear. These emotions were compounded by the fact that many women felt they could not speak about their experiences due to the stigma associated with being a victim of sexual assault. The stigma associated with being a victim of assault further isolated them from society. Many women were shunned by their communities and even their own families. This social rejection intensified their psychological trauma, leaving victims feeling alone and unsupported. The fear of being marginalized prevented many women from seeking help or speaking about their experiences. Even children born as a result of the violence were often stigmatized, called illegitimate, and sometimes abandoned or given up to state care. The mothers of these children faced extreme social pressure, and the children themselves grew up with the burden of their origin. The trauma affected not only the women but also their families. Husbands, fathers, and brothers often felt powerless to protect their loved ones, leading to feelings of hopelessness and anger. The destruction of traditional family roles, upon which Nazi society was built, where men were expected to protect women, created a sense of failure among male family members. This further complicated family relations, leading to long-term social consequences. The crimes of violence also contributed to the breakdown of trust within communities. People became suspicious of strangers and even their neighbors. The fear of being assaulted by Soviet soldiers led to feelings of isolation among individuals and families. This eroded the sense of community and mutual support that was crucial for survival during the war. The crimes also had a significant impact on German national identity. The violence committed by Soviet soldiers was viewed as a form of collective punishment for the actions of the Nazi regime. This created a sense of victimization among the German population, who felt punished for the crimes of a few. This victimization contributed to the formation of a complex and contradictory national identity, where feelings of guilt and shame over the actions of the Nazi regime coexist with feelings of anger and resentment towards the Soviet occupiers. This sentiment would influence German attitudes toward the Soviet Union for decades. Today, many years later, most of the victims of the widespread violence of the spring of 1945 have passed away. The world still remembers this period as the glorious moment of the fall of Berlin, marking the end of the Nazi regime. The testimony of these women, who bore the brunt of unspeakable violence, remains a lesser-known chapter of the history of the Second World War. This story is a stark reminder to the world of the profound human cost of war and the enduring pain of those who suffer its horrors.